I am on the offensive side. My name is Trenton Ivey, and I am the Red Team Technical Lead for SecureWorks. Offensive security is my passion. So I know this is a defensive conference, so thank you for letting me come here. I saw right on the head of the website this is a conference for people who love defense, and too much credit goes to the offensive side of security. And I agree, and part of the reason that I wanted to come here is because I think that my team, or the offensive side in general, not just my team, has contributed to a problem that has made defensive more difficult. And so I wanted to talk through that and hopefully at least be part of the solution as we move forward and have discussions. A lot of the topics that have been covered today in the philosophy track, I feel like I will be repeating. So that's kind of cool to see that we're already starting to get into the echo chamber and have some of the same discussions. So play a game really quick. What vulnerability is this? Heartbleed. Very good. What about this one? Poodle. Nice. How about this one? Show shock. Anybody? Less popular one, little older. Ghost, yes. How about this one? Okay, drown attack. Point of this exercise is to show that the industry has become very vulnerability-centric. We like to think in terms of vulnerabilities, and they get published, the media picks up on them, we promote them, and InfoSec is very vulnerability-centric. Yesterday I went to Reddit NetSec, and pulled out a list of some of the top articles. If you look through all these are very vulnerability-centric articles, which nothing wrong with that. I love a new vulnerability or an exploit. I think research is incredibly important. And we need to try to find new vulnerabilities to make ourselves better. But the point of this is to say, once again, the industry as a whole has become very, very vulnerability-centric. If you ever go to a conference and look at the marketing side of things, and SecureWorks is not innocent of this either, but there's a huge push on our product fixes vulnerability X, right? And everybody's going to promise plug this box in, and then you're safe from this threat. And I think that vulnerability focus has caused potentially a problem. And then here's where I can be guilty, and we'll put myself on the block as well. When we write a penetration test report and you look at what typically gets released, everything is very vulnerability-centric, once again. So a typical engagement, we'll find some SQL injection in an application that somebody forgot to update somewhere. We'll exploit that, and we'll use that to pull back credentials, and then we'll crack those credentials, so we'll write up weak application credential, and then maybe we'll use that to get a web shell. So we'll write up maybe web services running with system privileges, which we find way too often. From there, maybe we'll get clear text credentials in a configuration file, and then move over to primary account compromise of a domain admin. This happens all the time. But what we convey when we give our reports often is, as penetration testers, we say, you need to go and fix vulnerabilities. And there's value to that, don't get me wrong. There's absolutely value to fixing the vulnerabilities. But I think that it's only a small part of the problem. And I think one of the disservices that we have done to the defensive side is to have this vulnerability-centric mindset. I think the industry is very vulnerability-centric, but I think we need to step back and think about how we could do it better. Breaches occur with vulnerabilities, not by them. So when I'm doing a test, vulnerabilities are something that I can leverage as a tool, but the vulnerability itself is not the only thing. And I think there's a whole lot more that if we step back and look at the big picture, we can do a better job as defenders. At least I would hope so. So this is what I want to propose. I've gotten to work with a lot of organizations over my years of penetration testing. I've gotten to sit in a lot of boardrooms and talk to executives about what's important and what's not. And I think I've seen some people that have done it very well. So I want to share what I've observed companies that do security right do. And then we can try to talk about maybe ways that we can model that as defenders and then hopefully help everybody else do the same. So first, I think it's critical to start with intelligence. And there are a ton of different definitions around intelligence. What I'm not saying is that you have to go and have a world-class threat intelligence program, right? I think the best decision I've ever come across for intelligence is decision support. So if I were to give you an IP address of a threat actor, is that intelligence? Yes or no? seeing some people saying yes. I'm seeing a lot of people saying no. Okay, what if I give you an indicator of compromise on a system that ties it to Fancy Bear? Is that intelligence? Getting could be, I'm getting yeses, I'm getting nos. You have to start with a question. For intelligence to be useful, it has to be able to support decision. That is knowledge or information, but for it to become intelligence, you have to back up and find out what are you trying to answer and what are you trying to do with this. Knowledge does not equal intelligence. I heard an analogy, and I wish I could figure out where I read it from. I'm stealing this from somebody. It's not my own. But if you take the world's greatest chess master and you stick him across the chessboard from me, we're going to be looking at the exact same board. We have the same knowledge and information about the landscape in front of us. Who's going to win that scenario? Right? Definitely not me. And it's because they can take the same amount of knowledge and apply it by using intelligence. And they can take that knowledge and have it work as decision support. So when I say start with intelligence, this is what I mean. When I begin a red team assessment with our clients, one of the first things that I like to ask is what's most important. And almost all the time, clients will come back with, oh, well, our client's payment data. Or, oh, system X, this PII, this regulated stuff. And I say, look at all the organizations that have gotten that compromise within the last year. How many of them have gone out of business? It's a very, very small number. So when we define critical assets, I like to say, what's the thing that makes you most unique as an organization? Right? This is not necessarily the payment data in all situations. It's the secret sauce, the thing that puts you at a competitive advantage. Right? Let's identify those things first. That way, when we think about how to build our intelligence around defense, we can start with what's most important in mind. Then there's key assets, right? There's all the other things that are important. If they get breached, they're going to get in the news. It may not put you out of business, but it's still not something you want to have happen. And then finally, think about related assets, all of the things that are connected. When you're building out defense, you want to have intelligence around all of these. I think another important question to ask is, what is the attack surface? This is one thing that I see organizations failing to do over and over and over and over again. They don't understand what they're even trying to defend. And so I think defining some of those key questions as a group here is a good place to start so that we can start to build intelligence and share it as a community. Once we've started with intelligence, I think that it helps to study threat actor behavior. So I mentioned that we're very vulnerability-centric, but one of the things that we need to do to start moving away from that is to look at how threat actors behave. So this was brought up earlier. I think one of the earlier talks, John, correct, did a great job of modeling some of the ways that the kill chain can work and how we can visualize that. I think that that's really important, and I think it's also important that we try to relate that concept, that kill chain, to our key and critical assets in our environment. So by understanding how threat actors work, you can begin to model how they may try to work in your environment. I think it's important that we as a community, and I've seen this, I think the very first, Sunil had this on one of your first slides, is the importance of establishing a common language. I think that if we are going to succeed as an industry, this is incredibly critical. I was told a story as a kid about the ancient Babylonians. The current worldview was that the earth was underneath a dome and there was holes punched in it and the light was coming down through heaven. And so the idea was, let's build a tower and see if we can get up to God. And as the story goes, God decided that was a bad idea and made everybody have a different language. And this was the Babylonians, thus the word Babel, and when we say Babel, which I'm doing somewhat now. But I think there was another thing that never really got taught to me from that story is when people try to do great things, one of the biggest things that can get in the way is lack of communication. And so to me, if there's one thing that I'd say is most important about all of this, this is probably one of the bullet points that I'd put on first, is we've got to find ways to communicate with ourselves. I know this is one, people have thrown out a bunch of frameworks, I'm throwing out one more. It's like the XKCD comic of where you get a bunch of smart people together, try to solve a problem, you end up with a whole bunch more things into the mix. I was going to add it, but I thought I was going after lunch, so sorry for the lack of humor there. But if you haven't taken a look at the MITRE attack matrix, it's an awesome start to a way that we can look at threat actors and how they behave. It starts with the tactics that an attacker would have to use. This model is very post-exploitation focused, and I think it needs to be extended to include the exploitation part, that pre-exploitation part, but it's a really good start. When we try to compromise an environment, there are many, many different steps that we'll go through. And to do that successfully, there are a lot of different things that we have to achieve before we can get out with the goods, right? And so if you look at the top row, I know it's kind of small text, I apologize, but I'll read a few of them. We need to do things like establish persistence once we get into an environment. We have to elevate our privileges. We have to try to avoid getting detected while we're there. We have to try to get credentials. We have to find what we're even going after, right? Some of these environments we get put into, like their own IT administrators don't even know half their environment, and then they give us a week to figure out where everything is. We have to move laterally once we find what we're going after. We have to escalate, we have to collect data, exfiltrate data, and we have to establish command and control. So these are common things that you're going to see threat actors doing in most of the cases. And then under those tactics, there are several techniques that are used to achieve those tactics. And so if you look at something like credential access, right? How do you get credentials? Well, maybe you could brute force them, or you could dump them from memory. So there's different ways that you can go about achieving a tactic. In some cases, one technique may relate to multiple tactics. But by trying to define this out, we can start looking at behavior instead of vulnerability. So an example of tactics, techniques, and procedures, again, a tactic would be lateral movement. Maybe the technique associated with that would be something like pass the hash. And then the procedure comes down to the actual tool or technique, or I'm sorry, rather the tool or the process that the attacker will use. So in this case, like say like you could run pass the hash with WinExe. Vulnerability-centric models stick all of their emphasis on the procedure, right? Let's catch the tool. Let's catch a signature of an exploit. What they often fail to do, I think, is to back up the chain and say, okay, we've identified this signature, this procedure. What was the technique that was associated with it, and what was the overall tactic with that? So I think the third thing that we have to do to get to the techniques and procedure-centric approach instead of a vulnerability-centric approach is within our environments. I think there are several ways to do this, but there's one way. First, we need to continually collect intelligence. Now, this doesn't just mean threat intelligence, right? There's a lot of different types of intelligence that you can use. Again, decision support. So I don't know if everybody would normally consider things like event logs, process information, net flow, all of those as intelligence. But if you think of it as intelligence, it can become very useful because now you can begin to make decisions about how you act or respond to behavior or in your environment. Once you've done that, you can create signatures for threat actor procedures. I say threat actor procedures, right? I went to, not trying to pitch product, but I went to one of our leads for a product that we have called Red Cloak, and I said, you know what? Our red team wants to take the malware that you're seeing throwing 0-day, reverse engineer that, and then add it into our kit so that we can quickly turn around, like let's use the bad guys' research and dev time to make ourselves better, right? And they said, well, we don't really track new 0-day exploits in the product. Like, we're not looking for that. What we actually care about is that Microsoft Word just spawned a process that connected to that internet that didn't just set a registry key in something in scheduled tasks. Right? So we're looking at behavior. And so if you start to signature for behavior then and procedures, then what you can do is try to associate those observations with tactics and techniques. So we're seeing this thing here, right? The example I just gave of a malicious Word document from a phish. Right? The technique then would be exploitation through social, or the tactic would be remote exploitation through social. The technique would be macro-enabled document, and then the procedure could have various parts depending on how the document worked. If you look at the tactics and techniques, you can then start to ask other questions of what other related tactics and techniques should I be observing if this was successful or if they were trying to continue on. Right? So this is where you come down to pulling the thread, taking that and seeing how far you can go with that information. And this is where I think from my perspective, a lot of people get it right, but more people probably get it wrong from the defensive side, is that we fail to pull the thread, and I think this comes back to not having a standardized framework or a way to step back and look at the bigger picture. If you ask the question of what tactics and techniques would needed to make this particular event happen, then you can start to look for other artifacts quickly. And if you have all the intelligence that you can sift through, you can start to figure out what happened prior and where might they be going. And so you can ask the question of what will happen next, which puts us in a much better spot from a defensive perspective. And then finally is respond, right? You've got the information to identify the threat. You need to do something about it. Oftentimes I'll have clients say that, well, we caught you, like we see you, we win, but detection does not equal response. If you're going up against an actual threat actor, right, they don't care half the time. It depends on what their motive is, right? But oftentimes they won't care whether you detected them or not. The question is, did they achieve their objectives before you were able to stop them, right? And so this response portion, I think, is incredibly important. The other thing is detection does not equal attribution. Just because you detect me doesn't mean that I can't change the way that I behave and come back from a different perspective, right? So if I use one tool and you catch it and you stop it, then a lot of people say we win, right? But if you as a defender can then say, okay, they are trying to achieve this technique to accomplish this tactic, what other techniques and tactics might be occurring? And you can use that to look at other places in your organization to see if that behavior is happening anywhere else and drill down a little bit deeper. You're in a much better spot to catch me. At the end of the day, I want you guys to catch me, not on my engagements, right? I want to get through it, but from a large perspective, right? I'm on offensive so that we can have a better defensive. I think that the models, we've talked about this already a couple times today, right? The prevent, detect, respond. We have to find a way to balance those aspects. I think prevention is incredibly important. We still need to look for vulnerabilities in our environment, but we also have to start looking at detection and response more. I think the model that was laid out today was one of the best I've seen in terms of thinking about that whole framework. So thanks for that. Finally, I think being purple. So anybody heard of the idea of like purple team, right? I've got a couple hands. The concept is you have a red team, and our primary goal as a red team is to test our target's ability to detect and respond to a threat. So penetration testing is generally, let's find those vulnerabilities. Let's identify things to fix. But the red team's goal really is to, let's see how well you can detect and respond to what we do. The blue team's goal is to detect and respond. And I think what often happens when you segment those two teams is that you have one team that doesn't get to see everything, right? We know whether a client detected and responded based off of whether we got away with it, but we don't get to always see everything in between unless we set up and are very intentional about collaboration. So I think that there's a lot of value in it. From our perspective, hopefully we can find or can share ways that we've attacked things that maybe were never thought of before. And you can go back and update your body of knowledge about the tactics and techniques that threat actors might want to use in your environment. And from our side, right, not that you always want this, right, but having an understanding of what did or didn't work can also make us better. So if you've got your own red teams or you're using somebody else, you can explain what did catch them so that we can continue to evolve and become better, both as red team and blue team. I think to do that, you have to facilitate a culture of understanding different points of view. One of the things that we've recently rolled out at SecureWorks was a near company-wide capture the flag event, and it's been fun. It's just starting, so it's kind of in beta. But one of the cool things is that we've been able to send out puzzles that are very offensive, but we can also send out puzzles that are defensive-based. And then we have everybody try to capture the flag, win the event, but then at the end of it, we'll go back and then share the results of everybody's write-ups on how they went about that problem. And it's been fun to see the way that different people from both defense and offensive will go about solving a problem, which helps us to kind of build that collaboration in that language. If we go back and look at the tactics-based approach to security, right, I could retell the penetration test story a little bit better. If instead of saying, starting with we found SQL injection, right, we start with the tactic of discovery via the technique of network service discovery. That then provides you an opportunity to say, hey, did we see that type of behavior? Right? Are we able to detect network service scanning, and what is our response, and is it appropriate, right? We talked about exploitation via SQL injection. Instead of writing up the vulnerability, SQL injection, we can comment on the exploitation aspect of it. What controls could be in place? Are we able to detect and respond? Persistence via web shell, right? When you think of a web shell, you should stop and say persistence. What other persistence mechanisms may be here? What other things could they try to do to maintain that environment? How did they get here in the first place, right? Pull that thread. We can go on and on and on. Privilege escalation, lateral movement, credential access, data collection, data compression, and exfiltration. when you think of when you think in terms of tactics, techniques, and procedures instead of vulnerabilities, I think it provides a much better opportunity to build out the defensive capabilities of your team. So that's it. I know I'm standing between everybody and lunch, so I tried to make that very quick. I apologize for going so fast. But are there any questions for anybody? Yes, sir.
I know as red teamers we've got plenty of war stories about hacks, but can you share a good defensive story?
A good defensive. So the question was, I've got a bunch of hack stories, but can I tell a good defensive story? Yeah. Trying to make sure I don't get in trouble. So we had an engagement where we had a client, their external perimeter was really solid. Their attack surface was minimized. Like we banged on it, but just couldn't find anything. And so we tend to escalate. We start with like remote, and then we'll move towards more of a social engineering aspect. And if that doesn't work, we'll just break into the building. And so we were at the social engineering phase. And so we were really excited about this one. We went ahead and set up a fake website for a legal entity, fake lawyer website. And we put together a manila envelope with, sorry, so this maybe shouldn't go online, sorry to the lawyers in the company. This doesn't reflect the opinion of my company, or et cetera, et cetera. But we put together a manila envelope with a fake cease and desist letter, because we saw during open source intelligence phase that they were going through some lawsuits or had some in the past. And then we put a CD in that envelope that says all of the data is encrypted on this file. Here's the password, yada, 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 and send it off to the company. We had it tracked, like we were watching like our FedEx alerts, like, okay, it's there, and waiting for a shell, and then nothing happened. And so we were like, okay, what did we do wrong? Like this, like we've got a website for this entity. It's in a mail envelope that was sent via courier the same way that they have to deliver legal. We know that this fits the profile of what's going on. Apparently, it got to the secretary, and they had such a good training that they first said, like, okay, this is suspicious. Like, we've never heard of this entity. I wasn't aware of this. Who does it need to go to? And instead of it escalating through legal, it actually went to security first. The security guy said, this is strange. I should probably do some research. So they went so far as to actually call up the bar of the state that we were pretending to be from and asked, does said legal entity exist? And they said no, because we didn't actually go as far as to make a legal entity. So from there, I think we called them up, like just to pretend to be the lawyers, like what's going on, and they completely shut us down after trying to get some information from us. So I think there are companies that can do things right, but I think going back to the idea of tactics, techniques, and procedures, you have to think about why an attacker is trying to do it, what the different pieces could be. From that, then they were able to set themselves on a higher alert, consider other things that we might be trying, and essentially they ended up shutting us down completely. It was one of the best defenses I've ever seen. So, yes?
Well, in your presentation, you started out with a whole bunch of vulnerabilities, and I noticed that most of them are open source. And one of the things that I struggle with personally on the defensive side is the fact that the way the open source community handles vulnerability management is way different than if you're dealing with a typical corporate entity. Like for example, if you got an open SSL bug, the only people that get like pre-notifications are OS vendors. And that list is very short. They give you a very short window. So often when that code comes out with mitigation, you're less ransom to protect both your infrastructure and your products. And you might not, you've got a very short window of information for the public.
Yeah.
There's some efforts in FIRST and other places to try to improve that. But I mean, how this information is shared, the coordination aspects, everything, makes it very, very often, if you're in a defensive position, you've got a window where you're exposed.
Yeah, so I think the statement, I don't know, was there a question there, or more or less a statement? So I guess it was about the difference between open source and private software approach. There are pluses and minuses to both, and they definitely, he mentioned that all the vulnerabilities were primarily tied to public. If you looked at the Reddit, most of those were not. So the vulnerabilities come from both sides. One of the advantages from the open source community is that you get a lot of extra eyes on code, which can lead to a lot more defense. One of the disadvantages is there is security through obscurity, right? And so you can handle it a little bit more. So there are pluses to minuses to both. And perhaps. I think a lot of my friends would take offense to that, but we can debate that over a beer later. So any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just a comment on your speaking of common language and some of this information sharing, like you talk about Purple Team. We've started an internal process where we start to see various attack vectors coming in through either physical or social or whatever. We start to advertise that now internally on our internal network and within chatter and stuff, and encourage people from different disciplines to start self-educating and having that discussion, so there's more awareness across all levels of the company.
Yeah, awesome. That's good. I'm glad that works.
It has started to really pay off in space. That's really good.
Very cool. Yeah, great. Yeah.
If anybody's like a manager type here, I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile purple teaming with the long-term security engineering type defense in the same organization. So we have one team where I work at Uber that is focused on longer-term engineering around defense, and then the purple teaming seems like a shorter cycle and much more aligned with sort of the threat ops type group. And I've been trying to figure out how to reconcile organizationally those two activities. So if people have any wisdom there, I'd be happy to talk to you. I'd like to learn.
Awesome. Yeah. And hopefully this will at least spur on some conversations. Please feel free to treat me as the bad guy as we have conversations tomorrow. And I'd be happy to take on the attacker role as we have discussions. Thank you guys. Have a good lunch.